German pilots laughed at the B-17's size, until the sky turned black with bombers. August 17, 1942, over the marshalling yards of Rouen-Sotteville, France, dawned with a thin layer of fog that would soon burn away under the late summer sun, revealing a sight that would fundamentally alter the course of aerial warfare and, with it, the trajectory of the Second World War itself. A formation of 12 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, gleaming silver machines, each weighing 32 tons fully loaded, stretching 74 feet from nose to tail, crossed the English Channel at 15,000 feet, their 4 Wright Cyclone engines thundering in synchronized harmony, producing a sound that would soon become the signature of American industrial might projected across European skies. German fighter pilots, scrambling from their forward airfields near the French coast, saw these massive bombers for the first time, and, according to recorded Luftwaffe communications and post-war interviews, many responded with incredulity bordering on amusement. These enormous, lumbering machines seemed impossibly slow, impossibly large, impossibly vulnerable targets that would be cleared from the sky within weeks. What those German pilots could not have known, circling above the French countryside in their nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon system that would eventually blacken the skies over the Third Reich with thousands upon thousands of bombers, delivering a scale of destruction that would systematically dismantle Germany's capacity to wage war. If stories like this captivate you, consider subscribing and tell us where you're watching from. It really helps us bring more stories like this your way. The initial German assessment was not entirely unreasonable given the tactical realities of 1942. The B-17E variant that first appeared over Europe cruised at approximately 182 miles per hour when fully loaded with bombs, making it substantially slower than the Messerschmitt Bf-109G, which could reach 386 miles per hour in level flight, giving German interceptors a speed advantage of more than 200 miles per hour that translated into complete control over engagement timing. Oberst Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished fighter leaders with over 100 confirmed victories, recorded in his combat diary that the American heavy bombers presented a fundamentally different challenge than the British night bombers, large, visible, predictable in their routes, and initially without adequate defensive escort. The Boeing B-17 had been designed around a specific strategic doctrine that massed formations of heavily armed bombers could defend themselves through concentrated defensive firepower, with each aircraft mounting up to 13 50 caliber Browning machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would theoretically prevent fighter attacks from any angle. German pilots quickly identified the flaws in this theory through practical combat experience. Ammunition was limited, gunners were vulnerable to hypothermia and hypoxia at altitude, and most critically, a determined head-on attack exploited the bomber's weakest defensive position while presenting the smallest target profile to defensive gunners. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, the 8th Air Force methodically expanded its operations from occupied France deeper into German-held territory, following a strategic bombing doctrine developed by American air power theorists who believed that precision daylight bombing could destroy specific industrial targets, ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil refineries, aircraft production facilities, whose elimination would cripple Germany's war machine more effectively than the British approach of nighttime area bombing. Each mission pushed deeper, first attacking targets within 200 miles of England where RAF Spitfire and American P-47 Thunderbolt fighters could provide partial escort, then beyond that range where the bombers flew alone. Major General Ira C. Yeager, commanding the 8th Air Force, faced a brutal mathematical problem that kept him awake through countless nights at his headquarters near High Wycombe. His crews were suffering unsustainable losses on unescorted missions deep into Germany, with loss rates sometimes exceeding 10% per mission, which meant that statistically, a bomber crew faced near certain death or capture before completing their required 25 mission tours. The German fighter forces, meanwhile, refined their tactics with each engagement, developing specialized formations and attack methods specifically designed to crack open the American combat boxes, the three-dimensional defensive formations of 18 to 21 bombers arranged to maximize overlapping defensive fire. By summer 1943, German fighter units had effectively created a layered defensive system across occupied Europe that exploited the range limitations of Allied escort fighters with ruthless efficiency. Radar stations tracked incoming bomber formations from the moment they crossed the English coast, providing early warning that allowed Luftwaffe fighter groups to position themselves at altitude along the projected bomber routes, waiting like predators at a waterhole. The escorts would turn back at their maximum range, usually somewhere over Belgium or Western Germany, and in that moment, which German pilots called the golden moment, the real slaughter would begin. Unteroffizier Heinz Knocke, commanding fighters with Jagdgeschwader 11, described the tactical evolution in his diary. We learned to be patient, to track the bomber formations on radar while conserving fuel, waiting for the little friends to depart before committing to attack, allowing us to strike with concentrated force against formations stripped of fighter protection for hours over the most dangerous portions of their missions. The German pilots were not laughing anymore. They had developed a healthy respect for the defensive firepower of massed B-17 formations and the courage of American crews, who continued flying despite horrific losses, but they possessed tactical superiority born from experience, superior aircraft performance in certain parameters, and the enormous advantage of fighting over friendly territory where damaged aircraft could land at numerous airfields and downed pilots could return to combat. October 14, 1943, a date that would become known in 8th Air Force history as Black Thursday, represented both the culmination of German tactical success against American daylight bombing and, paradoxically, the beginning of the end for Luftwaffe air superiority over the Reich. 291 B-17 flying fortresses launched from bases across England that morning. Their target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany, industrial facilities that produced more than 40% of Germany's entire ball-bearing output and whose destruction, American planners believed, would cascade through German weapons production like a stone dropped into a pond. The mission required penetrating nearly 400 miles into German airspace, far beyond the range of any available escort fighter, meaning the bombers would face approximately 4 hours over enemy territory without friendly fighter protection. German controllers tracked the formation from the moment it formed over East Anglia, vectoring every available fighter unit across western Germany toward intercept positions. Over 300 Luftwaffe fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader rose to meet the attackers, including specialized twin-engined destroyer aircraft equipped with heavy cannon and rockets designed specifically for bomber interception. The sky over central Germany became a three-dimensional battlefield of unimaginable violence, with bomber formations maintaining rigid discipline under sustained fighter attacks that came in waves from every angle, head-on passes by single-engine fighters closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, beam attacks by twin-engine destroyers firing 210 rockets that could obliterate a bomber with a single hit, and diving attacks from above that exploited the B-17's limited dorsal defensive coverage. The Schweinfurt mission lasted 9 hours from takeoff to landing, and in that span, the 8th Air Force suffered losses that shocked American commanders and raised fundamental questions about the viability of unescorted daylight bombing. 60 B-17s failed to return, representing over 600 highly trained aircrew killed, wounded, or captured, with another 17 bombers so severely damaged they were written off upon reaching England. German fighter pilots had demonstrated conclusively that even the heavily defended B-17 formations could be systematically destroyed when attacking targets beyond escort range, achieving kill ratios that made sustained operations mathematically impossible. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, a Luftwaffe fighter commander, recorded in his operational diary, "Today we proved what many had doubted, that determined fighter attacks can break even the largest American formations when they venture beyond their escort range. If they continue these deep penetration raids unescorted, we will bleed them white within months." In the days following Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration raids into Germany, while commanders wrestled with an apparently unsolvable problem. Strategic targets requiring destruction lay deep in German territory, but reaching them cost more aircraft and crews than America could sustain, even with its enormous industrial capacity. What neither side fully understood in October 1943 was that American industry and engineering had already solved the escort problem, and the solution was at that moment being prepared for deployment across England. The North American P-51 Mustang began arriving in substantial numbers with 8th Air Force fighter groups during late 1943, initially met with skepticism by pilots accustomed to the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt. But this skepticism evaporated rapidly when the Mustang's revolutionary capabilities became apparent during combat operations. The P-51B variant, powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard, possessed a combat radius exceeding 850 miles when equipped with external fuel tanks, more than double the range of previous escort fighters, meaning it could accompany bomber formations to Berlin and back, a capability that no single-engine fighter had previously achieved. The Mustang's performance characteristics read like a solution to every escort problem that had plagued earlier fighters. Maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at altitude, service ceiling exceeding 41,000 feet, excellent maneuverability across all altitude bands, and sufficient armament, 6 50 caliber machine guns with ammunition for sustained combat, to engage German fighters on equal or superior terms. But numbers and specifications alone do not convey the psychological impact of the Mustang's arrival. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to attacking undefended bombers deep over Germany, suddenly found themselves facing aggressive American fighters at altitudes and distances they had considered absolutely safe. March 4, 1944 marked a turning point as significant as any land battle or amphibious invasion. On that date, P-51 Mustangs escorted B-17 and B-24 bombers to Berlin for the first time, announcing to the Luftwaffe that no target in Germany now lay beyond the reach of American air power. Major General Adolf Galland, by then commanding all Luftwaffe fighter forces, recognized immediately the strategic implications of this development, later writing that the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin marked the end of German air superiority. We could no longer prevent American bombers from reaching any target they chose to attack, and our fighter force began dying in a war of attrition we could not win. The mathematics of the air war had fundamentally reversed. Where German fighters had previously enjoyed tactical advantages of position, timing, and combat over friendly territory, they now faced aggressive escorts throughout entire missions, forcing continuous combat that consumed fuel, ammunition, and most critically, experienced pilots who could not be replaced. American production capacity, which German planners had consistently underestimated, began manifesting in overwhelming material superiority. The United States produced 15,186 P-51 Mustangs during the war, along with thousands of other fighter types, while Germany's dispersed and increasingly bombed factories struggled to maintain production of any aircraft type. Every German pilot lost represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience, while American training programs graduated thousands of new pilots monthly, many assigned to units flying the Mustang, an aircraft that, in the hands of an average pilot, could match or exceed the performance of German fighters flown by experienced veterans. Throughout spring 1944, the Luftwaffe fought with increasing desperation to maintain control of German airspace, throwing fighters against the bomber streams in massive formations that sometimes numbered hundreds of aircraft, attempting through sheer numbers to overwhelm the escorts and reach the bombers. These large-scale engagements consistently resulted in disproportionate German losses as American pilots, flying superior aircraft, and often possessing better tactical position, methodically destroyed Jagdgeschwader that had been the pride of the Luftwaffe just months earlier. Lieutenant Heinz Knacke recorded in April 1944, "We take off with 20 aircraft, engage the Americans at altitude, and perhaps 8 return. The Mustangs are everywhere, diving from above, attacking from the flanks, pursuing damaged aircraft to ensure their destruction. They have learned our tactics and execute them with mechanical efficiency backed by unlimited numbers." The strategic initiative had passed entirely to the Allies. American bombers now struck targets throughout Germany in daylight with substantial fighter escort, while Royal Air Force Bomber Command continued nighttime area attacks, subjecting German industrial capacity, transportation networks, and urban populations to around-the-clock bombardment that no defensive measures could prevent. The psychological toll on Luftwaffe pilots became measurable through documented increases in combat stress reactions, rising loss rates among even veteran units, and the declining effectiveness of fighter operations as experience levels dropped throughout the force. The preparation for D-Day in June 1944 brought the full weight of Allied air supremacy to bear on German forces in France. P-51 Mustangs ranged across occupied Europe, attacking airfields, rail yards, bridges, and any visible German military movement, while medium and heavy bombers systematically destroyed transportation infrastructure that would be critical for German reinforcement of Normandy beaches. Luftwaffe units positioned in France to oppose the invasion found themselves unable to operate effectively. Attacks on airfields destroyed aircraft on the ground, strafing runs eliminated experienced pilots before they could reach their fighters, and fuel shortages grounded entire Geschwader at the moment of maximum need. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, Allied aircraft flew more than 14,000 sorties over the invasion beaches in French interior. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties across the entire day, and most of those accomplished nothing before being driven off or destroyed by omnipresent Allied fighters. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, reported to Berlin that our troops are virtually defenseless against Allied air attacks. Movement in daylight is suicidal. Supplies cannot reach forward units, and reserves cannot be committed without suffering devastating losses during approach marches. We are fighting with one hand tied because we have lost control of the air. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force in any conventional sense. Experienced pilots and complete units had been destroyed in the attrition battles of spring and summer. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft regardless of pilot availability or aircraft production, and American fighter bombers ranged across Germany virtually unopposed, attacking trains, factories, airfields, and any visible target with impunity. The sky had indeed turned black with bombers. On some days, American and British forces launched more than 2,000 heavy bomber sorties, escorted by similar numbers of fighters, creating aerial armadas that stretched for hundreds of miles and delivered thousands of tons of high explosives on German industrial and urban targets. The Luftwaffe's last major effort came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when German forces assembled fuel reserves sufficient for Operation Bodenplatte, a massive strike against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland intended to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and provide temporary air superiority for the Ardennes offensive. The operation, launched January 1, 1945, achieved tactical surprise and destroyed or damaged several hundred Allied aircraft, but at catastrophic cost, the Luftwaffe lost more than 300 fighters and, more critically, over 200 pilots, including numerous experienced formation leaders and unit commanders. Following Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe never again assembled sufficient forces for a coordinated large-scale operation. The final months of the war saw the introduction of German jet aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Me 262, which possessed performance characteristics that exceeded any Allied aircraft and could, in theory, have challenged Allied air supremacy. But the Me 262 arrived too late and in too small numbers to affect the strategic situation. Fewer than 300 saw combat. They suffered from engine reliability problems that limited operational availability. And they required long-paved runways that became priority targets for Allied fighter bombers, who would orbit known Me 262 bases waiting for the jets to land when they were most vulnerable. German pilots who flew the Me 262 universally praised its performance, but acknowledged the futility of tactical superiority against overwhelming Allied numbers. One pilot recorded that flying the 262 was like riding a thoroughbred racehorse through a cattle stampede. You might be faster and more elegant, but eventually you'll be crushed by sheer mass. By April 1945, most Luftwaffe units had ceased operations entirely due to lack of fuel, ammunition, or pilots. Aircraft sat dispersed in forests and along autobahns, painted but never fueled, waiting for resources that would never arrive. The transformation from August 1942 to May 1945 had been complete and irreversible. The German pilots, who initially laughed at the size and apparent vulnerability of the B-17 flying fortress, had either died in combat, become prisoners of war, or witnessed from the ground as thousands of Allied bombers turned German cities and industries to rubble. The strategic bombing campaign that they had once believed they could prevent had delivered nearly Tornado 1. 5 million tons of bombs on German targets, killing hundreds of thousands, rendering millions homeless, destroying entire industrial districts, and forcing Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense, resources of personnel, industrial capacity, and fuel that could not then be used for combat operations on the eastern or western fronts. The B-17 flying fortress, that supposedly lumbering giant that had seemed so vulnerable in 1942, had formed the backbone of the 8th Air Force throughout the war, eventually flying more than 290,000 combat sorties and dropping more than 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets. Statistics and tonnages, however, fail to capture the human dimension of this transformation. The 19-year-old German fighter pilot climbing into his Bf-109 in October 1943, confident in his tactical superiority. And that same pilot, if he survived, watching helplessly in April 1945 as formation after formation of bombers passed overhead beyond his reach. The strategic air campaign over Europe demonstrated fundamental principles about modern industrial warfare that extend beyond the specific technologies and tactics employed, that wars between industrialized nations become contests of production capacity as much as battlefield prowess, that technological advantages can be overwhelmed by numerical superiority and systematic application of resources, and that underestimating an opponent's capacity for innovation and adaptation invites strategic disaster. The German pilots who laughed in 1942 had assessed the tactical situation correctly based on available information. The B-17 was slower, less maneuverable, and more vulnerable than their fighters. What they failed to anticipate was American problem-solving capacity, the ability to recognize escort range as the critical limitation, to develop a solution through the P-51 Mustang, and then to produce that solution in such overwhelming numbers that tactical superiority became irrelevant. The laughter had been premature, born of confidence in current capabilities rather than appreciation for the adversary's potential capabilities, a mistake that military commanders have repeated throughout history with consistently disastrous results. If this kind of storytelling inspires you, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us what topic you'd like to see next. The lesson extends beyond military history into any human endeavor where initial appearances may deceive. That size, when backed by resolve and industrial capacity, can overwhelm speed. That apparent vulnerability can mask strategic resilience, and that laughter at an opponent's expense often precedes a very painful education in one's own limitations. The sky that turned black with bombers over Germany teaches us that sustained commitment to a strategic vision, paired with the industrial and human resources to execute that vision despite initial setbacks, can overcome seemingly insurmountable tactical disadvantages. Those 12 B-17s that crossed the Channel in August 1942, objects of German amusement, had by May 1945 become part of aerial armadas numbering thousands, having written across the skies of Europe an enduring testament to the proposition that free societies, when committed to victory, can outproduce, outinnovate, and ultimately outlast any totalitarian system that underestimates democracy's capacity for industrial mobilization and technological achievement.